On August the 12th, 1978, a young teenage couple madly in love decided that they'd spend the night together camping on the beautiful Torrey Pines State Beach. It was set to be a romantic night under the stars with the sound of waves crashing in the distance. But little did they know that this idyllic night was about to turn into a deadly nightmare. Barbara Nantais was discovered brutally strangled, sexually assaulted and mutilated. And her boyfriend Jim was left with life-threatening injuries. His life literally hanging in the balance. Her savage killer somehow managing to evade the police, sadly being left free to strike again years later. This is a tragic tale where two beautiful young girls had their lives cruelly cut short. And still to this day, they haven't received justice. This is the case of the Torrey Pines Beach murders. Those of you who are regulars to my channel, you already know that I love Magellan TV. And the reason for that is it is packed full of crime content. This week, I watched Sleepwalkers Who Kill. And it does leave you conflicted at the end of the day. If you don't actually know that you're committing a crime, have you actually committed the crime? So I'm going to recommend that you all tune in to that. Just to let you know, if you don't know what Magellan TV is, it's incredible. It adds 15 to 20 hours of new content every single week. So true crime fans will never run out of something to watch. And essentially you can get a month for free. That's right. You can take advantage of my special offer in the link in the video description so that you can watch my recommended documentary that I've just given you and the rest of Magellan TV's extensive true crime collection. Like I said, the best thing about Magellan TV is new documentaries like this are literally added every single week. You will get a 1 month free trial by clicking on the link in the description. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me today. If you're new to my channel, I release my crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, so if you like crime and consistency, this is definitely the channel for you. Moreover, the fact that I say that every single time people watch my videos would also demonstrate consistency. Today's case is one of those that leaves you frustrated, but also I think raises more questions than answers, so to speak. I genuinely feel like there are so many holes that have been left unfilled in this case that it does leave you a little blindsided. And also, it's always really unhappy when you don't have closure for a family. Murder will never ever leave a family being able to completely close the door on the situation, because ultimately you've lost somebody of infinite meaning in your life. But at least when you know what played out and you have certain answers, it can lessen the endless questions that you were left with. So let's talk about our first victim, Barbara Nantais. So she was born in 1962. She was born to Ralph and Judy Nantais, and her dad described her as being someone who was tough as nails. She had a real inner strength, and she was someone who was really feisty. She knew who she was and she was willing to fight for who she was, so to speak. Her mum describes her in such a beautiful way. She said that she was a defiant, beautiful, pain in the ass, wonderful daughter who God gave to her to keep her humble. I think that is just such an incredible description. It introduces us perfectly to the kind of character that Barbara was. Somebody who is challenging at times because she knows herself and she's developing into the person that she's going to become as an adult. And also an individual who's clearly very loving and keeps them on her toes, but is somebody that's clearly a respected individual in the family life. She was one of 4 siblings, so that had been a relatively busy household. She had 2 older sisters, Lorraine and Sue. She had a younger brother, Tom. Barbara was dating a boy called Jim Alt. She'd met him through her sister, and they'd been dating for quite a while. Bear in mind, they're teenagers, and they'd been seeing each other for 9 months. Can we all agree that when you're a young person, 9 months is like 45 years of marriage for anybody who's an adult? But it shows commitment, it shows loyalty, it shows a dedication to a relationship, and it shows an emotional maturity. So they were a couple who were really respected in their local area because she was beautiful and he was this surfer. So Jim had been somebody who'd even been featured in a wetsuit advert in a surfing magazine. So you can absolutely imagine that in high school, he would have literally been a celebrity. And when you look at them as a couple, they are the all-American dream. They're both gorgeous, they're both fit, they're young, they've got everything to live for, and they're popular amongst their peers. And people who knew Jim, they said that everyone looked up to him. He was just that guy that everyone liked, respected, and wanted to be around. Also, lots of girls fancied him. It makes sense because he was a very attractive young man, but he only ever had eyes for Barbara. So he genuinely had fallen for her, and she was the only person that pricked his attention, full stop. Her sister Sue described Barbara as being a really outspoken, but a very popular, funny and strong-willed character. She was a cheerleader, she loved the beach, and one of the things that you can automatically tell is if you're a cheerleader, you are definitely going to be somebody who stands out, you're going to be talented, but you are going to be one of the stalwarts of the school. And what we're seeing about Barbara is when you think about the future she would have had, everything is leading us to a position where we can understand that she's going to succeed. Sue, her sister, also said that Jim had an amazing personality. He was the life and soul of the party. And when people looked at them together, they were kind of a power couple. There was just something that cemented them as far as their relationship was concerned, but also solidified that within their community because people respected and admired them. Their personalities clearly complemented each other. And Jim actually said that Barbara had stolen his heart the moment he saw her. He said it was love at first sight for him. And of course, we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't absolutely know that Jim and Barbara would have stayed together forever. But certainly the foundations seem very, very strong. Even though they'd only been seeing each other 9 months, everything was suggesting that they were in it for the long haul. And this adds another layer of sadness to this story because clearly these are lives full of promise and lives that essentially had their futures totally changed because of the outcome of what occurred in this crime. So on August the 12th, 1978, this is when the horror begins. Barbara's parents, they're going away for the weekend, and family friends left in charge of watching the children. And when Barbara's mum, Ralph and Judy, leave, Barbara and Jim decide that even though she's meant to be home, at the end of the day, they have the option to, shall we say, be a little bit mischievous. So going against her parents' wishes, Barbara and Jim go to the beach with Jim's friend Rick Selger and Rick Selger's girlfriend. They just wanted to spend the night there. We all appreciate it's naughty to do that, but we've all been 15 and Barbara was 15. You kind of think that you are a young adult and that you can make up your own mind and do your own decision making. And even though you don't appreciate at the time that the reason that the adults around you are advising you not to do things is for your own benefit, you go ahead and do these things because in your mind, you know better. And it's a reflective exercise psychologically as you get older when you realize that they weren't being hard on you or being down on you. It was just they were trying to protect you. But for Barbara, it will feel unnecessary. She's 15, she's got her boyfriend, she's going with her friends. What could possibly go wrong? It is the bias of security that so many of us live by. We all imagine that if we make a decision, nothing's going to go wrong with that. Because if we didn't have that mindset on the whole, we would be overwhelmed with anxiety on a daily basis. We need to believe that we can do things and do them safely. And even when other people look in and say, well, no, A, B, or C can go wrong, you still build pictures that suggest, well, not for me. They won't go wrong for me. And that's what Barbara will have done. So she decides that she knows it all at this point. Her parents wouldn't allow her to do it. And therefore, she's going to make the decision to override and overrule that. And she's going to go ahead anyway. So she waits for them to be out of town. And she goes to the beach with her boyfriend and friends. They go to Torrey Pines State Beach. It's on the Californian coast in San Diego. It's bursting, and I mean bursting with natural beauty. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now, Rick and his girlfriend, they wanted to sleep in the car. Barbara and Jim, they wanted to sleep on the beach in sleeping bags under the stars. And understandably, when you are young teenagers and you're having a level of intimacy with your boyfriend or girlfriend, you are going to want some space. So it makes sense to me that they didn't all sleep in the car. They just wanted to be alone with their respective partners. And going and sleeping under the stars would have felt very romantic. And you're listening to the waves crashing in and the sound of the wildlife around you, and the stars are shining in the sky. And it's a backdrop for something truly beautiful. But what you don't appreciate is that when you are doing something like sleeping on the beach, you're completely exposed. You're vulnerable. And we shouldn't be wandering around every day thinking, oh, I really need to look over my shoulder constantly. I really need to be afraid of my surroundings, because, as I said, that would be catastrophic for us on an anxiety level. But often when we do things like sleeping out on a beach, we're not thinking that we could be very unlucky, because you are completely vulnerable, particularly if you're asleep. And if you happen to have a malevolent character around you, unknown to you, then you are understandably going to be in danger. Jim said that the last thing he remembers when he was falling to sleep was that he had Barbara in his arms. And bear in mind, this was young love. So there's going to be a high level of intensity within this relationship. And the idea of losing one another would be too terrible to even imagine. So here we are, Barbara's in his arms falling asleep. This gorgeous romantic setting should have been an absolutely perfect night. But their bliss just turns into a night of horror, because as they are sleeping, someone attacks them. And when I say attack, what I really mean to some degree is butchers them. So Jim has been viciously beaten. He's been knocked unconscious. When he actually came around, he was unsure of what had played out. He didn't know what was going on. He was very confused. But what he did notice was Barbara, the girl he was in love with, wasn't there. He had no idea of what had happened. He could barely see. At that moment in time, he wouldn't really compute what was the reasoning behind not being able to really see. But it turns out that the extent of his injuries were so severe. He was literally blood-soaked and really badly wounded. And this had blurred his ability to be able to note his surroundings, along with the confusion that he'd feel because of the blunt force trauma. Now, despite the fact that he is blood-soaked, that he's wounded, he still manages to drag himself to Rick's car, because heroically, all he's concerned about is Barbara. He tells his friend that he can't find her. And he wants him to go and look for Barbara. He wants to know that she's safe. Rick said that when he saw Jim, all he could see was this blood-soaked, swollen mess. He almost didn't even recognize his friend. But Rick straight away dutifully rushes down to the beach, because understandably he's thinking, if this is how Jim looks, there's a strong possibility that Barbara has also been attacked. He runs down, starts to look for her, and it's not long before he finds her. But unfortunately, Barbara has been murdered. She's naked, she's beaten, and he said he knew instantly that she was already dead. There was nothing that he could do. They alert the authorities, and the police get to the scene quickly. At this point, they're able to establish that Barbara had been very violently sexually assaulted. She'd been raped both vaginally and anally. This is a 15-year-old girl. It's incomprehensible to imagine the kind of terror and horror that she would have endured, along with the pain when this attack was being carried out. But to add to this horrific reality, her right breast had been mutilated, and that instantly makes me think about a lust killer. So you can't help but imagine that somebody who kills in such a brutal way has potentially killed before, or at least been involved in very high-level sexual violating crimes before. Also, the extent of her injuries is horrific. She's got a cracked skull. She had lots of injuries to her face. And that's dehumanization. When you eradicate the physical features of somebody by beating them so brutally, it kind of removes who they are physically. She'd also been strangled, and her mouth was full of sand. So the terror of choking on sand, if that had happened while she was being strangled, it's a horrific image to carry. Now, Jim had somehow miraculously survived the attack. He had been attacked with a variety of things, so rocks and also logs from the fire pit. and he'd suffered quite a serious traumatic brain injury. He required this emergency surgery. His injuries were considered life-threatening. So when he is seen by the emergency services at the actual crime scene, he's taken immediately to the hospital. He's in a coma for a while, but he does thankfully recover. Frustratingly though, he didn't have any recollection whatsoever of what had happened to him and Barbara. And that makes perfect sense because he had a traumatic brain injury. And also we have to remember that when somebody is involved in a highly traumatic event, sometimes as a way of protecting that individual emotionally, the brain literally shuts down. It doesn't remember things because the trauma is too great to remember. So it could be both of those things colliding as a protective mechanism just to survive your future, essentially. So this means that he can't give any information to the police, so he can't actually actively help the investigation in that way. But he's not considered to be a suspect right from the get-go because the beating that he'd received was so life-threatening that it nearly killed him, and there's no way that he could have inflicted those injuries by himself. So they do what they consider is a thorough investigation, but the police are unable to find Barbara's killer. They don't have any leads really, and this is complete torture for her family because not only have they had the daughter brutally murdered on a night when they thought that she was just entirely safe at home, but to not have the killer brought to justice, to know that somebody is wandering around who has snuffed the life out of your child in the most brutal and gruesome of ways, that must haunt every single minute of your day. And it has to add to the layer of grief and the layer of anger that they'd no doubt experienced because their child has been stolen. And the images that they will have in their head about how her final moments were are things that will consistently come up on a daily basis because you can't help it. It's like tinnitus. You know, sometimes those memories will be whispering, sometimes those memories will be screaming, but you are absolutely indelibly connected to those final moments. August the 24th, 1984. This period of time has passed 6 years since this horrific murder of Barbara and this brutal attack on Jim. And then all of a sudden, they're facing a similar tragedy. Another savage murder takes place on the same beach. Claire Howe's body is found on Torrey Pines Beach, and immediately investigators note there are eerie similarities between the way that she's been killed and the way that Barbara had been killed. And you can imagine, as an investigator, this is immediately going to terrify you because this could mean a killer who is now a serial killer is on the loose, and not just on the loose, has struck again and therefore may be striking elsewhere. Because it could just mean that dots haven't been connected and this killer has returned to the original scene of a crime to carry out another murder, but that wouldn't mean that they hadn't had the opportunity to do it elsewhere. So suddenly that soul murder has become something that seems far bigger than initially anticipated. Now, Claire, as an individual, she was described as really spirited. Her parents said that she was one of those people who she was always a mediator. So if there was a problem, she wanted to find a solution. If people were falling out with one another, she wanted to be the intermediary between them. And she had that nature that meant that she couldn't stand back. And they said that at times she would get into trouble herself because she'd defend somebody if there'd been any kind of injustice. And clearly, even though she was doing it for the right reasons, that could ultimately mean that she found herself in the line of fire as well. She hated bullying and she would always stand up for people who were being bullied. Her best friend, Kim, she said that the way that she would describe her was that she had this inner light. She had a real joy about her. Now, bear in mind, this young girl, Claire, was 14 years of age when she was killed, just being shy of her 15th birthday. A young girl with everything to live for, with all those qualities that I've just embodied in her description, and she ends up brutalised on a beach, just like Barbara before her. Claire grew up in Rhode Island, but in August 1984, the reason that she'd ended up in Torrey Pines State Beach was because she travelled up from San Diego to see her grandparents because they lived close to it. And She was known to love nature. She loved the beach. She loved the ocean. And when she was bored, she'd often sneak out when it was dark to sit on the sand and to just reflect and listen to music. Now, the mother in me instantly feels terrified because the idea of my teenage child going by themselves to the vastness of a beach at night automatically gets the hackles on the back of my neck standing up, because I just think about all the possibilities and problems that could occur. But I also know what it's like to be that 14-year-old kid. And you bet your bottom dollar I would sneak out and I would go places I wasn't meant to go, because of course I knew everything. I thought I had the confidence that would mean that I could deal with any situation. And even though I was entirely incorrect, tell that to my 14-year-old brain, it just would not have computed it. So I completely empathise with Claire and why she was going out to do that. And we also have to remember that for a lot of people, just dealing with a scenario where you're sitting on the beach and listening to the waves and just having that experience with nature, it's a real anxiety soother. So it can really help to calm people. And that's another draw to these environments. And I imagine that Claire, so too, was going because she just enjoyed the way that it made her feel being around nature. On August the 24th, that young girl's body is found on the beach. It's found by a beachcomber, Wallace Wheeler. And her body was found literally within a few feet of where Barbara had been killed. Now, instantly they can tell that she's been beaten really badly, she's been sexually assaulted, and she had also been strangled. Sand was stuffed in her mouth, and her left breast had been mutilated in a similar way to Barbara's. And when you actually look at photographs of both the girls, they do have a similar appearance too, so there's almost like a victim profile that you can look at and connect. Now, Wallace Wheeler, that's the guy who discovered Claire's body, he reached out to Claire's parents and said that he was a psychic and that he had this vision where an angelic girl was killed by two men. Now, I know that people have got different thoughts and ideas around psychicity, and I appreciate that the police have used psychics. In fact, I know a couple of psychic detectives, shall we say, and they have been quite helpful to police forces who've reached out to them. But I do think that they're very rare, and I think it's definitely safe to say it's almost unheard of that a person who is apparently a psychic finds the body of a young girl and then suggests to the parents, well, I've actually seen what happened and it was two men and I've seen these things occurring, and by the way, your daughter came to me and she was smiling. I think that that would provoke suspicion, because you're thinking, this feels a little bit convenient that you found my daughter, you say that you've been visiting visions, and also on top of that, you believe that you're a psychic who can help find out who killed her. Strange. And I would imagine they're not buying into the belief that he is indeed capable of what he's suggested. So they think that he could be the person responsible. Now, the police say, listen, we also think that's a bit weird, but let's be honest, there are a lot of individuals who are quite strange when crimes like this play out, and they do profess to know things that they shouldn't know, and they're innocent of being involved to any degree. So they just advise the family to keep communicating with him so that hopefully they'll get some useful information. Maybe he'll even confess to them. Wallace does keep communicating, sends letters to the Houghs saying that Claire was coming to him in visions and that she had this smiling face and radiant eyes. And I guess that for Claire's parents, this would feel a little bit off. But let's just go with this idea that Wallace genuinely felt that he had this connection with Claire. It could be that there's a level of delusion to what he's talking about because he was so traumatized by finding her dead, mutilated body, and therefore he starts to create these ideas that she's in a better place, a better space, maybe has dreams about it because his brain is trying to process the trauma. It wouldn't be too unusual for somebody to do that, to manage such an event, and he needs to express that to Claire's parents because he genuinely feels that actually she's in a better place, that she's in a good place now and that she's not in pain, etc. And he wants to pass that information on. Or it could be that he genuinely does have some kind of psychic powers, although I question that more, but arguably, who knows? I can't profess to. And I guess the final one is their idea, their theory, which is that he's the person responsible, and to deflect guilt, he's acting as if he is some kind of visionary who has been there for Claire, now she's passed over, to give messages back to her parents. But it's confusing for them. Now, the Houghs suspected Wallace, but he never confessed to the murder. And the police did say that they'd actually ruled him out. And then in 1988, Wallace actually killed himself. So this was 4 years after discovering Claire's body. He'd jumped from a building. His daughter said that the reason that she believed that he jumped from the building was he hadn't been taking his medication. He had a mental health condition. And again, that could mean that he was having some kind of delusions. So to other people, what he was saying might not have made sense. But if he was on particular medication and he was somebody who suffered from something like schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia or psychosis at times, these would indicate a possibility that he was having these kind of visions and hallucinations. And that would again be in line with him not being responsible for the murder, but being affected by the murder, and these visions playing out as a way of him dealing with the trauma itself. Now, in both the Barbara Nantais and Claire Hough case, it was very frustrating for investigators because they could not get the jigsaw pieces to fit the picture to a point where they actually brought somebody to justice. There were no promising suspects at all in the murders until 2012. So obviously technology moves on, and there've been a lot of advances in DNA testing. Now, they weren't able to establish a connection with anybody when it came down to the case of Barbara, but there was a match to the DNA evidence which was preserved from the crime scene of Claire's attack. And that linked 2 people to her murder. And you can imagine, can't you, the joy that they would feel, the euphoria that they would experience when they realise that they've got 2 people that they can connect these horrible crimes. Shockingly, one of those individuals was a criminalist who actually worked in the labs for the police, a guy called Kevin Brown. And basically, they found a microscopic amount of DNA inside Claire that was a match for Kevin Brown. But it's important to note that when vaginal swabs had been retrieved in 1984, no sperm had been detected on these at all. Also, Kevin Brown had no criminal record. The second suspect, well, I would say sparked more of an obvious reaction when they found out who he was. So that was a guy called Ronald Tatro. He was a convicted rapist. Also, blood on Claire's jeans was found to match Ronald's. Ronald had said that he had no control whatsoever over his desires to hurt women as well. That had been recorded, so people understood that this guy was a threat and a predator to women. And in 1975, he'd actually pushed a woman into the boot of his car and raped her while threatening her with a knife. So that immediately draws our attention to a violent sexual predator who is a risk to all women around him and has actively engaged in rape. So he's certainly fitting our MO right now. Also, he'd attempted to rape a teenager, and Claire was a teenager, so she's the victim profile. Apparently, he also used to tie up and rape his wife. So this is a man with really poor impulse control, a propensity for incredible violence, and a history of such violence towards women and teenagers. When I think about who seems like the more obvious suspect at this moment in time, Kevin Brown or this individual, I think we can agree this individual seems, I don't know, a little bit more likely. Now, these 2 potential suspects didn't actually know each other, or at least reportedly didn't know each other, but the police, they suggested that the 2 had worked together to kill Claire. Now, I am not a seasoned investigator. I do appreciate before anybody writes in the comments, you're not a seasoned investigator. I know, I'm not a seasoned investigator, but I have a brain. And my brain is quite logical, and I imagine that anybody listening to what I've just suggested regarding the profiles of these potential criminals working together, they don't exactly fit together. One's a criminalist, actually working for the police to bring forth those perpetrators by connecting them with DNA samples and actually getting guilty verdicts for those victims who've been affected by that. And the other is a violent sexual predator. I'm not sure whether these two would ever cross paths in real life. I guess that it could happen, but I don't necessarily feel that this makes a lot of sense. The idea that they would know each other and actually be working together, very, very unlikely pair. Also, literally no evidence in the past that they've ever met. So they were obviously doing this very, very quietly if they were working together, because surely there's going to be a bit of planning. You're just going to randomly meet somebody in a bar and be like, hey, do you want to go murder somebody? It just doesn't happen. So if there's no historical evidence of them being together, wouldn't that suggest that they just had never met because they weren't involved with each other? Now, by the time they have connected Tatrou's DNA with Claire, he was dead. So even though they've got evidence to link him now to that murder, they can't take him to task for it. He drowned in a boating accident in 2011. There is a lot of speculation, from what I understand doing the research on this case, that his death was actually a suicide. So, for example, his belongings, including his wallet, had been carefully placed in the boat. And that isn't something you would do if you just fell overboard. So the belief is that he deliberately went into the water. His death, interestingly as well, also occurred on the anniversary of Claire's murder. Now, often when we think about sexual predators, we imagine they're psychopaths, and therefore we don't envisage that they've got that much of a conscience about the killings that they've carried out. But it is possible that he had decided that this particular day was significant because of the true horror that it inflicted on that poor girl, and that he needed to pay the price for that. And when he took his own life, he was connecting that date with his own suicide and demise to kind of make good on what he'd done, maybe because he decided that by sacrificing his own life, he could acknowledge the horror of what he'd done to somebody else and the life that he'd stolen of somebody else, and was hoping that, I don't know, God might take some kind of pity on him. It also may just be down to the fact that it's coincidence. He might just have killed himself because at the end of the day, life was tough for him. He'd got quite a serious criminal record. I imagine he wasn't financially in a good place, and he just saw fit to end his life in this dimension because, I don't know, he fancied joining his maker in the other. And I'm sure that it's very, very hot where he's arrived. Now, both Kevin Brown and Ronald Tatrow actually had an alibi for the night that Barbara was murdered. So Ronald had a watertight alibi because he was in prison at the time for the kidnap and rape of a woman. So again, just demonstrating what kind of an individual Ronald Tatrow was. And Kevin, well, he was living far away from the crime scene at that point. He was a student in Sacramento. So he definitely couldn't have been involved in murdering Barbara. Kevin had actually began working for the police in 1982, and that's when he'd moved to San Diego. So this was really puzzling to the police because they had been absolutely certain that the same perpetrator had killed both Barbara and Claire. And the cold case homicide website itself, that even suggested there was a connection between the murders, but it doesn't always have to be the same person. We do know that copycat killings occur. They're rare, but they do occur. And there are lots of different beliefs as to why copycat killings occur. First off, it is down to the fact that somebody has got a particular fixation on the type of murder that's played out, and they feel titillated and excited, and they spend a lot of time looking at the information forensically in detail, and it kind of feeds and pumps this idea that they would like to go ahead and do exactly the same kind of thing to somebody else. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like putting a lot of information out there about school shootings, because they believe it can incite behaviour in certain rare individuals. There is also a belief that people take part in copycat killings because they know it will get more media attention, because it reignites the prior crime in the press, and therefore it gets more notoriety. So an individual who likes the idea of the inflaming of a prior situation whilst also causing further trauma by carrying out a copycat killing. At this point, the police, however, they decide that they're going to turn their attention to Kevin Brown. And there are some things in his past that they feel legitimise this. So first of all, he's got the nickname Kinky, because apparently he liked strip clubs, he liked porn movies, but no, not being weird, a lot of men do. This is not atypical behaviour. This is quite typical behaviour. Allegedly in the 1980s, he used to go to lingerie shoots for women. He was really interested in photography. And he also did private sessions with the models that he liked, but these were consensual. He wasn't a violent predator. There's no prior criminality in his background. And this is also all prior to his marriage to his wife, Rebecca, who he absolutely doted on. They had a really solid relationship. She loved him, he loved her, and their relationship was what we would consider typical. There was nothing weird. There was nothing red flag based in that relationship. And people can change. So you can be an individual who in your past has done things that other people would frown on. But it's really a leap, in my opinion, to look at somebody like Kevin Brown, who to all intents and purposes has been a very well-adjusted member of our society and has been in an intimate relationship with his wife and in a successful marriage, to imagine that in the background he's going out doing the most horrendous things. Another thing that apparently provoked concern over this man is that a female colleague didn't want to be alone with him because he'd allegedly read a rape report aloud and he'd referred to it as being funny. Now, again, I appreciate in this day and age, if somebody was to do that, they would lose their job. I absolutely get it. Is it appropriate? No. Is it a very dark sense of humour? Yeah. But up until recent years, that is something that people would do because people who work in certain lines, they are so desensitized to the horror within it a lot of the time that they have to do something to cope. And the desensitization is often characterized by doing things like finding things that are macabre and really dark, funny. It's a way of coping. I'm not legitimizing it. I'm not supporting it. I'm saying this is not unusual. If you work in the area of trauma, often the way that you will survive that and manage that without ending up traumatized yourself is to find humor in even the darkest of scenarios. So just because a female colleague didn't like to be alone with him because of that particular incident does not make him a danger and certainly doesn't make him a sexual predator. I'm not defending the fact that he found something about rape funny. He shouldn't have. But I'm saying when it is just a normal part of your job to constantly be dealing with trauma, then you can create the weirdest of coping strategies that others would look in and find absolutely abhorrent. And even though we can say, you know, it's bad humour to do what he's done, laughing at a report about rape, it isn't actually doing anything illegal. And it shouldn't lead on to imply that he's capable of getting involved in a murder, but it does kind of feel like that's what they did. So the information that they've turned up is that he's kind of basically had a reputation. And so the police used this to validate their idea that he was the kind of character who could commit murder. But that does feel like an enormous leap. When you look at somebody as a whole, you have to think about their personality throughout their life and their actions throughout their life. And really, there's not a lot that makes him a likely suspect. And even when they spoke to his colleagues, the colleagues said that he wasn't somebody who went to get involved in conflict. He was somebody who hated being confronted. He was actually known to be a real people pleaser. He had quite a nervous disposition, quite a shy disposition. And friends even noted that if you wanted him to say something, you could bully him into saying whatever it is that you wanted. So he doesn't seem to have a striking character that makes us immediately align him with a violent predator. But nonetheless, the police go down this route and they start questioning Kevin Brown about Claire, which we appreciate because clearly Claire's murderer and Barbara's murderers need to be found. But it does feel a little bit like they have tunnel vision at this point. So the police show a picture of Claire to Kevin Brown, and he said that he remembered her, but he also said he didn't know her personally, and he also mentions that he had never actually met her. Now, when Kevin was told that his DNA had been found on Claire's body, his immediate response is, okay, well, it must have been due to contamination. And he said, I had my hands in a lot of things there. And it should be noted at this point that he wasn't actually the person who analysed the evidence relating to Claire. So I can appreciate that him saying that he had his hands in a lot of things wouldn't necessarily alert the detectives to defend why his DNA was there. But nonetheless, he was in the vicinity of what was happening in the lab, which dealt with Claire and the DNA related to Claire. Now, the detectives also didn't initially tell him that it was his semen that had been discovered. But when they did, he was really confused. He said he didn't know how it could have happened. He was obviously blindsided because that's a really strong connection if your semen has actually been connected with a victim. And when he's asked if he ever had sex with Claire, he replied, "I don't remember if I did. I don't know. I don't remember. I don't remember every person that I may have been sexually intimate with, but I do know I'd never kill anybody." The time lapse, by the way, at this point, from when Claire had been killed to when they're questioning Kevin was 28 years. So that's a long period of time. And you can imagine if you've had quite a, shall we say, colourful sex life, you might not be able to recount every single partner that you've had. And Kevin actually said, well, maybe I've known Claire in the 80s. And one of the detectives said to him, "I don't believe for a second that you thought she was 14. He replied, "Well, I didn't. I had no idea." And that was interpreted as a sign of guilt. Detectives do that a lot. They give you this, "I know that you're not the monster that your crime would suggest you are, so I'm going to say I would never have considered that you were capable of doing A, B, or C, and it's just one of those things that happened without you being completely aware of." In this case, she was 14, but actually by doing that, it invites the perpetrator to admit, well, yeah, I didn't know that part, which then means that they're connected with the crime they're being investigated for. You see that in interrogation videos constantly. But when he answers that and says, "Well, I didn't know she was 14, and it's taken as a sign of guilt, it's kind of incorrectly done, because down the line, it turns out that Kevin was talking about a totally different Claire, and that was someone who'd been almost 30 at the time that they had been intimate. So you can understand that he's genuinely saying, "Well, I didn't know that," and that's because she wasn't. She was nearly 30. But that seems to implicate him in that moment. And bear in mind, there is this bias and belief that Kevin Brown is responsible, and that cemented the deal, so to speak. And even detectives down the line would later acknowledge that it sounded like he was talking about the completely wrong Claire. At this point, the police apparently made it very clear to Kevin Brown that they believed he was guilty. And it was an incredibly stressful time for him. He was apparently experiencing a lot of anxiety, and he already had a history of depression and anxiety. And his wife, Rebecca, said that they were constantly, perpetually living in a state of fear that the police were going to come to arrest him for a murder he didn't commit. And anybody who has ever been wrongly accused has to live with this kind of fear. But when you are being accused of murdering a child in a sexually aggressive manner that we're talking about where Claire is concerned, that would be truly terrifying if you were innocent. And Kevin Brown would also know, because of his work in this field, that DNA is really compelling. You put that in front of a jury and the chances are they're going to find you guilty. And again, that's going to additionalize stress, because if you're a member of a jury and somebody comes in and is like, "This DNA, this sperm sample, it's belonging to that individual alleged of these crimes," that's going to be something that means that you're very likely to think, "Well, yeah, he must have done it." And let's add to that the fact that we all know the odd person in the States, don't we, who's been sent down, even though people had an absolute knowledge that it was likely they were innocent. So he will have worked in that field, known that reality, and the stress must have been absolutely shocking. In January of 2014, there was a warrant to search Kevin's home that was applied for and granted. And the detectives who did that search later confirmed that literally nothing was found that linked him to the murders, but the belongings, which were seized by the police, were still not returned by the September, despite the review of the evidence being completed in April, and that caused Kevin extreme anxiety. His wife said that he had difficulty getting out of bed. Apparently his hands were shaking, he'd lost loads of weight, and he even seemed to age, because stress is one of the most debilitating experiences that you can endure. It's one of the biggest causes of disease. And when you are dealing with such intense stress, understandably, it's going to have an impact on your psychology and physiology. And really sadly, in 2014, in the October of that year, Kevin killed himself. Rebecca came home and she found Kevin's watch, phone, and a Bible on the table. Also, there was a passage underlined, which is all about being wrongfully accused. It's Psalm 109, 26-31. It says, "Help me, Lord, my God, save me in your mercy. Make them know this is your hand, that you, Lord, have done this. Though they curse, may you bless. Arise, shame them, that your servant may rejoice. Clothe my accusers with disgrace. Make them wear their shame like a mantle. I will give fervent thanks to the Lord before a crowd. I will praise him, for he stands at the right hand of the poor to save him from those who pass judgment on him." So to some degree, whilst he's taken his life, he's also left what I would suggest is a very powerful denial and actually an accusation of those who were coming for him. He's saying, I'm innocent and they've driven me to this. And one day I hope they pay for what they've done to me. When Rebecca found that psalm and found those items belonging to him, I'm sure that she knew that something terrible had happened. And that was confirmed when the police later knocked on the door and said that he'd hung himself on a tree near the lake house. He was just 62 years of age, so their marriage was cut short because of what had played out. And just one day after Kevin Brown's suicide, the police literally issued a press release. And that press release named both him and Ronald Tatro as the suspects in Claire's murder. So he's literally been dead 24 hours, and that happens. And one article by the Los Angeles Times, which was published 3 days after the suicide, had the headline, "San Diego Police Solve 1984 Killing of Teen at Torrey Pines Beach," in which the police officer said that he was very gratified and it's what we strive for. So basically now they've put him out as guilty in the press. Rebecca, his wife, said this: "The police have hounded my husband all year and he ended up having a nervous breakdown and he killed himself. They kept hounding him on something he didn't do. He's a good, kind, sweet, gentle man." His wife has never for even a second believed that he was capable of murder. She described him as an ordinary, nice, kind person, a total nerd with a sweet sense of humour, with not a mean bone in his body. And in December of 2014, Kevin's wife, Rebecca, sued San Diego police. She accused the police of illegal search and seizure misconduct in their investigation and wrongful death because obviously he took his own life. The basis for the lawsuit was that a really valid explanation for a trace of Kevin's sperm being discovered wasn't considered. It was argued that some criminalists keep their semen at the lab to test chemicals, and Kevin did this along with lots of other people who worked there, so contamination of the evidence could have occurred. And other criminalists at the same lab would have been using Kevin's sample. So it was confirmed that this used to be standard practice, which is kind of a bit blindsiding when you think about it in present day, because you immediately think, my God, that wouldn't be safe, using actual samples of people who worked in the lab, because surely that could implicate them in crimes. But back then, this is what happened. And the reason for that was that it was really expensive to buy semen samples. So this was a way of making sure that they had an abundance of them and it wasn't costing a fortune. John Sims, the criminalist who was actually working in the lab during the Hough case, said that in 1984, the crime lab didn't actually know about the DNA testing that was going to come. So therefore, the measures that in this day and age they would have to protect the people who work there just weren't in place. And that meant that cross-contamination could occur. Now, he said, as the person who was dealing with the Hough case, he didn't believe he had made a mistake causing contamination, but he did acknowledge that it was indeed a possibility. They didn't even wear masks at that point when they were handling evidence, and sometimes they'd handle multiple samples without even changing their gloves. So that is a minefield when you think about cross-contamination. And the fact that that wasn't even introduced when they were looking at this guy, when it was covered in the press, I mean, you have to ask yourself, why? Because to me, that suggests that they'd made a decision about Kevin Brown, or they wanted to pin the guilt on someone, and he was put in the line of fire, and they didn't want to move away from that belief system, in spite of the fact that this kind of evidence could change the outcome of people's perception as to Kevin Brown's guilt or innocence. In 2020, this is nearly 5 years later after she started to sue the police, Rebecca was awarded $6 million, and a detective who was involved in the case had to pay her $50,000 in punitive damages personally. And Rebecca and her attorney had actually said to that detective that they would have limited the payment to $1 if he'd apologised, but he hadn't done so. Obviously, for Rebecca, it was never about the money. She just wanted to clear her husband's name. Now, I cannot profess to know the absolute truth, but my initial reaction when I was researching and simply came across the fact that Kevin had been working in the lab where Claire's DNA was being dealt with was the fact that it was likely a contamination issue. You know, at the end of the day, there was no semen discovered in the initial vaginal swabs after Claire's murder, and that would suggest that the contamination occurred after, and that's why it was found later down the line. And so I do have a hell of a lot of sympathy for Kevin, and more importantly, for his surviving wife, Rebecca, because if ultimately they decided to pin this murder on him and also sully his reputation in the press after that, what a cross to bear for his family. Now, bringing it back to the victims, what's really sad is that really no justice has ever been given for those girls. We've got Barbara's case that remains open still today. We may never know the truth as to who committed the horrific acts I've described. And I guess it's really strange and quite chilling that 3 of the people who were connected to this case, so Kevin, Ronald and Wallace, had all, at least potentially in the case of Ronald, taken their own lives. The fact that Ronald was in prison during the time that Barbara was murdered, that seems to confirm that the crimes could have been committed by different people. But I guess that's if Ronald Tatro did in fact commit Claire's murder. There is, of course, that link between Kevin and Claire, but I think there is, as I said, a valid explanation as to why that link exists. But there is no way of explaining the DNA linking Ronald Tatro to Claire Howe's murder. So I do think that it's likely, when you think about his history, his MO, that he's potentially the individual who's responsible for her death. And I do believe that if Ronald Tatro was alive today, wow, the investigation would have gone so differently, especially if he could have confirmed that he'd never met Kevin, because then the theory that Kevin and he were working together would have been dispelled. And more importantly, that could have meant that Kevin Brown was still alive today and Rebecca, his wife, was still with the man that she was very much in love with. Like I said, I cannot absolutely state that Kevin was not involved, but to all intents and purposes, it really doesn't make sense to me at all. And it's worrying, because when investigators decide to fixate on a particular suspect, often it means that the true perpetrators get away with the horrible crimes they've committed. I'd love to know your thoughts on it. Please let me know. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Have you got any other information about this? And of course, I always struggle when cases are unsolved because Barbara and Claire deserve justice. And unfortunately, in this case, it really hasn't played out that way. Let me know your feelings, let me know your theories, and I'll see you again next time. Be safe, guys.